Hi, it's Lynn Shuck, and we're looking at the hip joint today, very specifically flexion. Hip flexion is where the front of the pelvis comes toward the front of the thigh, either because the thigh is still and the pelvis moves, or because the pelvis is still and the thigh comes up toward the front of the pelvis. Either way, this is hip flexion. A lot of us actually struggle with hip flexion even though we sit all day, and that's because when we sit all day, we tend to sit tucked under, which means this pelvis gets stuck about here and we just round the back to make everything else happen. So because we sit so much, because the front of the hip joint is so compressed and contracted, we want to learn how to free that up. And trying to take a forward fold and telling someone to relax the front of their pelvis toward the floor might not happen if their hamstrings are also very tight. They might get stuck here and they still end up in that same pulling on the lower back, not getting a lot of hip flexion. So let's find some places where the hamstrings aren't extended so fully, and maybe we can get a little more movement. So two different places where we can work on this hip flexion. One is lying on your back with your legs bent. And often when people come here, if they've been in that position where the pelvis tucks under a lot, the back goes flat immediately when they get here. So we want to see if we can lift the top of the pelvis away from the floor toward the thighs, and then press the top of the pelvis toward the floor. And as we're doing this, we're seeing if we can keep the rib cage fairly still. So it's just the top of your pelvis lifting up and then pushing toward the floor again. So if we were to talk about that in anatomical terms, we go from an anterior tilt, front of the pelvis lifting up, to a posterior tilt, front of the pelvis pressing back. Just seeing if we can create some freedom of movement here. Now you might have a very small amount of movement, so just go where you can work. The other place we could work on this is on all fours, table. So people come in here and we've been taught flat back for so long, and you can see I've got a flat back, but I also have a pelvis that is angled. And if I want to get my pelvis parallel to the ground, I'm going to relax my belly toward the floor, relax the front of my pelvis toward the floor. And this could be a place where you just play around a little bit with the pelvis too. It's the same thing I just did on my back, but I'm doing it here. Again, I'm not taking this much into the upper body. I'm trying to keep my ribs fairly still and isolate that there. If you want to take that into standing, sometimes if people are really tight, really stuck, I might have them lean their hands on a counter and then just try and relax and just see if they can let the front of the pelvis come forward. If they can bend over further, maybe they put their hands on the seat of a chair. And again, try and let this relax. Yes, eventually these muscles need to engage and support your spine when you're bending over. But if you're trying to figure out how to release this hip flexor, sometimes you just have to release that hip flexor. And creating more support can allow you to do that. So play on your back with your legs bent, or play in table, and just see how much movement do you get just at the pelvis. That's it. Hip flexion, and a little bit of movement into extension too, but mostly we're talking about hip flexion and how to get that pelvis to release forward. Working with the hamstrings is a whole other conversation. You can go through my videos and find forward fold. You'll get a lot there. But just trying to allow this image of front of the pelvis relaxing forward toward the floor and eventually toward your thighs. That's what we're going to work with today. Go.